Aloha, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Daniel K. Inouye Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies webinar on terrorism, special operations, and the coronavirus. I'm Lumpy Lumbaka. I'm one of the faculty members here at DKI APCSS. We've got a great group of experts lined up to talk with us here today. To our audience members, there's about 350 of you out there from all around the world, literally. So whether it's good morning, good evening, or in the middle of your nighttime, welcome to the webinar and thank you for tuning in. I'd like to share a special welcome to our alumni who are in the audience. There's quite a few of you out there. Welcome home to our alumni. I will now turn the mic over to Colonel Jason Clark, who will provide us some administrative notes before we hear from our speakers.
Thank you, Professor Lumbaka. Good afternoon, evening, or morning. My name is Colonel Jason Clark. I'm the U.S. Army War College Fellow to APCSS. And a couple of admin notes as we get going today. First and foremost, this is an unclassified brief. Second, this is a webinar format, so we will have a question and answer button down below of your screen. And we will also be recording this as we move forward so we can share this with all of you on our apcss.org website. After the webinar is complete for today, we will send out an email to all the registrations for a survey, a post-webinar survey to get your feedback. Also, we're going to follow a couple APCSS guiding principles of transparency, mutual respect, and inclusion, as some of you already have seen that before. And this is also a non-attribution event. So if you do want to use any of the information provided today, please reach out to the speakers to get their permission. And lastly, although the DKI APCSS is a DoD institution, the remarks and opinions today is not reflective of the DoD. Now I'll pass it back over to Professor Lumbaka to introduce our panelists.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jason. So you will have seen our panelists' full biographies when you registered for this event, so I will give you a brief introduction to all three of them. First panelist will be Dr. Zachary Abuza. Dr. Abuza is a professor at the National War College in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on Southeast Asian politics and security issues, including insurgencies, terrorism, governance, human rights, and maritime security. He's the author of 5 books, the latest being Forging Peace in Southeast Asia, Insurgencies, Peace Processes, and Reconciliation. He's a frequent commentator in the press and has been a congressional witness on 3 occasions. Next up will be Commander Alex Bine. Commander Bine received a BS from the U.S. Naval Academy and a Master of Science from the Naval Postgraduate School. He served on 5 ships before being assigned to Special Operations Command Pacific, where he has served as a counterterrorism planner. He supported the 2018 APCSS Countering Violent Extremism Organization's workshop in Manila and was the Maritime Syndicate lead for the bilateral CT talks with the Philippines in 2018 and 2019. Both Dr. Abuza and Commander Bine today will be discussing terrorist dynamics across the Indo-Pacific from 2 slightly different angles. Our third speaker today is Colonel Retired David Maxwell. Colonel Maxwell is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. He is a 30-year veteran of the U.S. Army Special Forces, and among his many assignments, which can't all be listed here today, he served as the Chief of Staff for Special Operations Command Korea. He commanded the Joint Special Operations Task Force Philippines, served as the G3 for United States Army Special Operations Command, and culminated his service on the faculty at the National War College. Following retirement, he served as Associate Director of the Security Studies Program at Georgetown University, and he currently teaches unconventional warfare and special operations for policymakers and strategists. Today, Colonel Maxwell will be discussing Special Operations Forces, or SOF, in the era of great power competition. Okay, before we turn it over to our first panelist, those of you who are familiar with APCSS will know we are fond of polling. So we've got some polling to bring up for you tonight, and we ask that all of our audience members participate if you don't mind. There are 3 questions here. You have to scroll down on your computer screen or your phone screen to see all 3 of them. Please note that the polling is completely anonymous and that it's optional. You do not have to participate in the polling if you don't like, but this will give us all a better idea of what the audience thinks about some of our hot topics. So the first polling question is, what is the #1 security challenge in the Indo-Pacific region for the next 5 years? Your choices are traditional military conflict, economic crisis, terrorism, violent extremism, natural disasters, maritime encounters at sea, weak governance at sea, cyber, space, and climate change. Okay. So please vote on the first polling, and then you can scroll down to the second question, which is, how's the coronavirus further enabled terrorists and transnational organized crime in the Indo-Pacific? All right, we've got quite a few results coming in, and I'll show you the results. I'll be happy to share that with you once we get most of our attendees polled. And our third question is, Special Operations Forces, or SOF, play an important role in accomplishing strategic competition objectives. So we'll give this one a few minutes and see how it goes. Results are still coming in. Okay. Hopefully, all right, we've got some great numbers coming in. Thank you very much for participating in the poll. And now I'm going to show you the results. John, if we could share the results of the poll. All right. You can see here, what is the #1 security challenge in the Indo-Pacific for the next 5 years? And economic crisis came in at #1, and terrorism and violent extremism came in at number 11, 9%. Let's see. Now we will slide down. Has the coronavirus further enabled terrorists and transnational organized crime in the Indo-Pacific? 46% said yes, and 46% said it's too early to tell. And then finally, our #3, Special Operations, or SOF, play an important role in accomplishing strategic competition objectives. 34% strongly agree, and 50% agree. All right, so these are some great results which will help our panelists inform their speaking and when they answer your questions today. So I will now stop sharing the results. John, if we could pull this down, and without any further ado, I will turn the mic over to Dr. Abuza.
All right. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to start by doing a very brief overview where we came from, and then talk about kind of 4 trends that I'm seeing in terrorism in Southeast Asia. And, you know, I really agree with that poll that in terms of the hierarchy of threats to the region, it is not a major one. It is a manageable threat, but it is a threat nonetheless. You know, we go back to the Bali bombings in 2002, and the rise of Jemaah Islamiyah opened up the Pandora's box with the first suicide bombings in the region. You had annual bombings, you know, with Jakarta, the JW Marriott attack, the Australian embassy, followed by, once again, smaller attacks in Bali, simply because that tempo of one attack a year was not bringing the government of Indonesia to its knees. And then you saw, again, an escalation of attacks, suicide bombings, simultaneous attacks in the JW Marriott and the Ritz-Carlton hotels. By 2009, JI was really riddled with divisions. It's not that people thought that targeting Westerners was morally wrong, but there was a group that said this is simply counterproductive. Every time we do these attacks, we're getting rolled up. You had people under Abu Dujana that wanted to go back to Sulawesi and Ambon in the Malukus to wage sectarian conflict, because very simply no one in Washington or PACOM or Canberra was cared about those attacks. You had a pro-Al-Qaeda wing that was out there, and then you had a couple militants who had been in southern Philippines that really wanted to try to bridge the divide between these two camps. They headed off to Aceh to set up a terrorist training camp, and they wanted to engage in kind of JAD style attacks. If you remember the 2009 Mumbai attacks, that's kind of the model they were adopting. By 2011, JI was basically defunct as a militant organization. The last attack they perpetrated was an attack on a police mosque outside of Jakarta in Cirebon. But by then, they were nothing. Goes through until about 2014, you really see very little violence in Indonesia, but that all changes with the rise of the Islamic State. You get Southeast Asians start to make their way to Iraq and Syria. Soon there's a critical mass that they're establishing their own Bahasa-speaking unit, Katiba Nusantara. You see Southeast Asians from the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia starting to appear in more and more videos of beheadings and other propaganda films. And then you start to see this spread also into the southern Philippines. Groups like the Maotes starting to emulate the imagery of the Islamic State, the Abu Sayyaf themselves, trying to rebrand themselves in terms of being a pro-Islamic State grouping. This really culminates in the 2017 siege of Marawi. It was simply too hard, too difficult to get Southeast Asians in numbers to Iraq and Syria. The Islamic State Center really instructed more Southeast Asians to go to Marawi. They held off the Philippine armed forces for 5 months before the city was retaken. It was a huge propaganda win, but it really left the Islamic State, especially in the Philippines, quite weak afterwards. By 2016, you're starting to see some more attacks in Indonesia, in Jakarta, suicide bombings in Semarang, and importantly, in central Sulawesi, the rise of the Mujahideen Indonesia Timur. Now, I want to talk now about 4 trends that I'm seeing. The first has to do with suicide bombing, and I've got 2 conflicting trends that I want to talk about. The first is, yeah, we're seeing suicide bombing in Indonesia. In fact, if you recall the 2018 bombings in Surabaya employed entire families down to 8-year-olds. I mean, just absolutely sickening. And you really have to ask, who the hell does that? You know, it's one thing to sacrifice yourself, but your children? And when I look at this, I really think that the JAD, the Islamic State affiliate in Indonesia, was actually operating out of weakness, that this was done to cajole other militants, that they weren't pulling their weight. They weren't fighting this Indonesian state fiercely enough. And 2 families really wanted to show the sacrifices that they were willing to make for their religion, for their cause. We saw more recently in November 2019 a suicide bombing in Medan at a police station. No one but the bomber was killed. And one of the points I want to make is that because the Islamic State does not orchestrate attacks themselves, they simply inspire or help support attacks, you get a huge range. Some are very professional, some are very competent, and others are very amateurish. The trend in the Philippines is somewhat disturbing. We really never had suicide bombing in the southern Philippines, and yet since 2018, there have been 6 individual suicide bombings. There were 3 other suspected or would-be bombers who were arrested. The majority of these, at least 7, were foreigners, but 1 and maybe 2 were Filipinos. So that genie is out of the bottle. And that's one thing that we need to watch. The second trend is that we've seen the loss of the caliphate more or less in Iraq and Syria. And I'm not saying that they cannot regain it. They cannot try to fight back. They're working very hard. But as the Islamic State adopted a global insurgency model, one really would have expected Southeast Asia to be much more important to the Islamic State. They're trying to broaden the battlefield. And frankly, we just didn't see it. It's petered out in Southeast Asia. And, frustratingly for Southeast Asian militants, the Wilayat, that province of the caliphate, was never formally declared. The third trend I want to mention is that you're really seeing a spectrum of attacks in Indonesia. A stabbing of former Minister Wiranto, even the attack a couple weeks ago, a sword attack on a policeman. These were really amateurish attacks. This is not the A-team of terrorists. And yet you had the takedown of a cell in Sumatra last year that was incredibly proficient with a large cache of TATP, which requires a technological threshold. So let me move on to the final trend and kind of the segue to Commander Bain and talk about the influence of COVID-19. Indonesia and the Philippines have both been hard hit, but Indonesia in particular, with 48,000 cases, 2,500 dead, with estimates about 3 times higher. And yet we really don't know the scope of either of those because the rate of testing in Indonesia is woefully inadequate. Where right now it's 1.47 per 100,000 people. Now, my colleague Alif Satria and I just published a piece in The Diplomat today. And what we did is we looked at 3 different Indonesian terrorist groups, JI, the JAD, and the MIT, to really see who was best poised to respond to COVID-19. And what we basically determined is that the Islamic State group, the JAD, was probably the least able to deal with it. Killing is what they do. They've really never been in the business of providing social services or governance. They're too horizontal. They're not hierarchical at all. And the charities that they have used to date have really been focused on providing support for incarcerated militants' families. So they've never really gone beyond the in-group. The MIT is slightly better poised to take advantage of this, but they are so focused in central Sulawesi. They have deep ties to the community. We know that, and we have seen them start to get involved in the provision of social services following the 2018 earthquake in Palu. But still, we're not sure really how able they are to capitalize. Our real concern is that the rise and return of Jemaah Islamiyah. Since 2010, the government has given them ample space to engage in proselytization, run mosques, madrasas, charities, publishing houses, as long as they have stayed left of boom. And they have done that because it's simply a bad time to engage in militancy. They have never rejected militancy, but right now they're happy to let their rivals, the JAD, take the body blows of the Indonesian state. JI has a long history going back to 2004 of providing social services in Aceh following this tsunami. In 2006 with the Java earthquake, they have numerous charities at their disposal. They're hierarchical, their organizational structure is much better suited for this, and they have a long history of reaching beyond their in-group and providing social services and assistance to other people beyond their immediate constituency. Do I think that COVID-19 provides terrorist groups any real opportunities? For JI, clearly it is there to broaden their support, their messaging, their outreach, broaden their constituency. But right now, with a pandemic and the double whammy of a recession, it would not be smart for any group to really engage in terrorism in Indonesia right now. They would really lose a lot of popular support. And with that, let me turn it over to Commander Bain.
Thank you, Zach. And a big thank you to APCSS for putting this on and allowing me to participate. I'm Commander Alex Bine from SOCPAC, and I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about how coronavirus is a condition of the operational environment. Think of it as a like freezing rain on a sports field. Both teams must deal with this, and the team that can adapt most adeptly will win. Just like the two teams, you have security forces and you have violent extremist organizations, which I'm going to call VEOs. Both must deal with this condition of the operational environment, which happens to be the coronavirus, and they have to adapt. And the team that can adapt will win. The next slide. So the condition of operation. I'm sorry, previous slide. So the coronavirus is a condition that affects all aspects of the operational environment. Everyone must balance the risk of protecting themselves from the virus and being operationally active. Additionally, countries have instituted travel restrictions internationally and locally, which affect the movement of people, the movement of weapons and supplies. And you add in social distancing. People are in isolation right now. There's still social distancing. We have a captive audience. The VEOs have a captive audience. What are we going to do with that captive audience? The group that can most quickly adapt to the coronavirus operational environment will seize the initiative. Next slide. VEOs have shown their agility through their information operations campaign. There have been a variety of messages from VEOs regarding coronavirus. Specifically from Islamic State, they said initially it's divine punishment against Western nations for their oppressive treatment of Muslims, and that Allah will protect true believers. As time wore on, they came up with a more realistic, more thoughtful narrative, but that the coronavirus is God's will and beyond our understanding. And Muslims will die along with the Crusaders, but believers who die in the Great Plague will be martyrs. And of course, all along they're blaming the West for the viral outbreak. And next slide, please. Just like us, VEOs are having to rethink and adapt their responses to the pandemic. With social distancing, access to large gatherings has diminished, and thus their targets are smaller. There are no crowds. The economic slowdown affects terrorists too. With their ability to move black market goods, weapons, components diminished, their funding stream and ability to conduct attacks is correspondingly reduced. With the global audience focused on the horrible impacts of the coronavirus, there is less attention on terrorism. And this causes that attacks and recruitment are likely to be less effective, at least in the short term. Next slide. So SOCPAC has operational concerns. There are a number of factors that could increase the risk of terrorism in the Indo-Pacific region. First is prisoner release. Tens of thousands of prisoners have been released from prisons in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Malaysia. These prisons have been ripe for radicalization for years, and such a large release of a large number of people at the same time could be very problematic. Additionally, up in Kashmir, since the repeal of Article 370 Alpha, which gave autonomy to Kashmir, that was repealed nearly a year ago now, ethnic tensions between Hindu and Muslims in Kashmir have grown steadily. To make it worse, heavy-handed tactics of security forces have played into the hand of VEO narratives. And it's led to an increase in terrorist activity over the recent months. Kashmir could potentially become the next terrorist hotbed, or even sparking a regional war between Pakistan and India. As impacts of the coronavirus stretches national resources of our partner nations and economic disparity within those partner nations, governance vacuums could emerge and be filled by VEOs. And additionally, we've seen misplaced anger throughout the AOR as groups assign blame to the coronavirus to their opponents. There's a potential for violence and instability. VEOs in Indonesia specifically have targeted ethnic Chinese because they blame them for the coronavirus. And in India, the Hindus are blaming Muslims for spreading the virus. These local strifes could lead to sparks of instability. So how do we adapt? Coronavirus is a condition that affects how forces operate. It affects our risk calculus. Does a commander cease routine missions to prevent infection, or does he use the uncertainty and relative calm to strike? We have seen that security forces and VEOs take both actions in the region. A critical component is information operations. Information operations allows us to get into message to this captive audience and counter message the radicalization and the VEO narrative while they're hunkering down during COVID. So in history, we've learned valuable lesson of combating insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, one of which was the development of cross-functional teams that pushed decision-making authority down to the lowest practical level to ensure agile decision-making. Retired General Stanley McChrystal wrote these lessons down in his book, Team of Teams. Every situation is different, but the lesson is clear. An imperfect decision made rapidly in a dynamic environment is far superior to a delayed decision, no matter how perfect it may be. Finally, a crisis can be a powerful turning point. It can bring nations together, or it can drive a wedge, depending on how we respond. We can undo generations of effort, or we can develop a lasting partnership over a very short period of time. VEOs are not constrained by national borders, and CVEO efforts, counter VEO efforts, require international collaboration. We have to keep our alliances strong. Thank you for your time. Now I'm going to turn you over to Colonel Dave Maxwell.
Thank you, Alex. Well, good evening and afternoon or good morning, wherever you may be. And again, my thanks also to APCSS for hosting this, and thank you to my good friend Lumpy Lamaka. I noticed on the survey that 33% checked great power competition on the first question. So I hope my remarks will be of interest to those who are concerned about that. I'm going to talk about, my focus is going to be on U.S. Special Operations Forces and great power competition. And I'm going to introduce some new conceptual concepts, constructs for special operations. So you're going to hear me repeat them more than a few times, as I really want to plant some ideas with everyone. Although I'm describing this new construct and new ideas, my basic thesis is that traditional and historical special operations approaches and doctrine will remain relevant and timeless. Now, the U.S. national security and national defense strategies prioritize great power competition and conflict. The United States faces two revisionist powers, China and Russia, and two rogue and revolutionary powers, Iran and North Korea, as well as the enduring threat of global violent extremism. Now, these threats are likely to persist for decades to come, and it will be up to the United States national security apparatus, along with friends, partners, and allies, to deter, contain, cope, manage, and where possible, defeat these threats. Now, this is the fundamental threat we face, particularly in Asia. China seeks to export its authoritarian political system around the world in order to dominate regions, co-opt or coerce international organizations, create economic conditions favorable to China alone, and displace democratic institutions. And we see this play out in China's concepts of unrestricted warfare and China's three warfares of psychological warfare, legal warfare or lawfare, and media or public opinion warfare. Along with selected hybrid military activities, together these combine to form a Chinese concept of political warfare. Now, in short, we face threats from political warfare strategies supported by hybrid military approaches. And we should note, China will take advantage of the instability and unrest caused by violent extremist organizations. So everything that Zach and Alex said, you can expect that China will exploit what they talked about. Now, we must understand this threat to countries. This is a threat to countries that value freedom, individual liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, rule of law, and human rights. You know, at the very root, this is an ideological war. Rather than the Clausewitzian concept of war being an extension of politics or policy by other means, the revisionist and rogue powers believe it is politics is war by other means. Now, in this environment, special operations forces must continue to focus on high-end counterterrorism operations, something which we have developed exquisite capabilities to execute, and really, in my opinion, have raised to a high art form. But given the 21st century security environment, special operations forces must also focus on what I call a new modern soft trinity of irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, and support to political warfare. Advanced counterterrorism and other high-end soft capabilities combined with this soft trinity is where special operations forces must invest in organization, manning, equipping, training, education, and investing in relationships with friends, partners, and allies. And now not only must we outfight our enemies, special operations, interagency partners, and allies have to outthink them. As T.E. Lawrence said, irregular warfare is far more intellectual than a bayonet charge. Now, all great concepts come in threes: fear, honor, and interest, passion, reason, and chance, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, presence, patience, persistence, political defiance, political resistance, political violence, ends, ways, and means, and many more. So it is time for special operations forces to have its own trinities. As previously stated, the first is an overall soft construct of irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, and support to political warfare. The second is the comparative advantage that special operations forces bring: governance, influence, and support to indigenous forces and populations. The ability to work through, with, and by to achieve mutual objectives. These areas are most often represented by civil affairs, psychological operations, and selected special operations forces from all the services who are optimized to conduct unconventional warfare, foreign internal defense, and counterinsurgency. Now, we must have an equal focus against violent extremist organizations and support to the U.S. national and defense strategies against revisionist powers and rogue and revolutionary powers. The traditional special operations capabilities can and must be applied across the spectrum of conflict, from traditional engagement to countering violent extremist organizations to great power competition in the so-called gray area to major state-on-state war. Now, if I was going to recommend a special operations forces strategy in great power competition, I would start with the new strategic approach to China the White House released on May 26, 2020. It is designed to begin operationalizing the national security strategy. Now, since special operations forces like to tout the 3 Ds of diplomacy, development, and defense, which actually were coined by the U.S. Embassy with our Philippine allies in 2006, we can support the new concept with the 2 soft trinities. Again, the first, irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, and support to political warfare. And the second trinity of governance, influence, and support to indigenous forces and populations. It is important to remember that special operations forces will be in support of political warfare, in support of statecraft, in support of diplomacy, as well as in support of and in partnership with our friends, partners, and allies. Now, the new strategic approach to China has 4 lines of effort for the United States. Number 1 is protect the American people, the homeland, and the American way of life. Number 2 is to promote American prosperity. Number 3 is to advance American influence. And number 4 is to preserve peace through strength. Special operations forces are well suited to support the latter 3 in particular. Now, while these are American-centric concepts, our friends, partners, and allies have similar objectives that are unique to their countries. Together, we have mutual shared interest, along with shared values, and we need shared strategies. Now, I would develop a Special Operations Forces supporting plan that would be built on the national level political warfare strategy that would incorporate the economic development and influence concepts called for in the new strategic approach to China. I would do a geographic laydown of China's One Belt, One Road, or the Belt and Road Initiative, as China likes to call it, which affects some 70 countries around the world. 23 of these countries are under threat of the Chinese debt trap. I would focus soft priority efforts in conjunction with the State Department to support key countries to enhance security relationships and offer alternatives to China's economic co-option and coercion. I would employ Special Operations Forces capabilities to support the Department of State's emerging concepts of the Blue Dot Network and the Economic Prosperity Network, as well as the State Department's Global Engagement Center, again, in key locations around the world and in particular in Asia. The essential U.S. organization for advancing American influence is State's Global Engagement Center. Special Operations Forces influence capabilities play a critical supporting role. The Global Engagement Center is charged with orchestrating the messaging of the U.S. government to counter disinformation and propaganda from state and non-state actors. And the primary focus has been on non-state actors or violent extremist organizations. However, the Global Engagement Center must shift from the reactive countering to proactive messaging. It must take the initiative to advance the concepts of the Blue Dot Network and the Economic Prosperity Network, and it must base messaging on the fundamental American values. Again, the competition with China is ideological, and the Global Engagement Center must develop themes and messages around the ideas of freedom and individual liberty, liberal democracy, free market economy, rule of law, and human rights. This is the core of the national security strategy and critical messaging that is necessary to advance U.S. influence. Finally, our State Department makes the critical contribution to the concept of peace through strength. One of the most important elements of national power that is crucial to military strength is the U.S. alliance structure. The State Department plays the lead role in sustaining individual alliances and advancing the U.S. alliance structure around the world. The military, and in particular Special Operations Forces, play a critical supporting role in sustaining alliances. With a strong and robust alliance system, the U.S. military is able to ensure interoperability with friends, partners, and allies, and to project power to key locations to deter conflict. Now, this is one way that I would use Special Operations Forces to play its supporting role in great power competition. It will be in support of the broader national level political warfare strategy. Now, yes, our exquisite high-end counterterrorism capabilities will always be a top priority, but there are special operations capabilities well beyond that critical mission. These are represented, again, by the 2 soft trinities. I'll say it one more time: irregular warfare, unconventional warfare, and support to political warfare, and the comparative advantages of special operations forces of governance, influence, and support to indigenous forces and populations. SOF can be a significant force multiplier in support of this national political warfare strategy because of relationships with friends, partners, and allies. Together, like-minded nations can compete with and counter and defend themselves against the revisionists and rogue powers. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Colonel Maxwell. For the audience, a lot of questions have been coming in. If you look down in your at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A section. If you'd like to type in your questions, we'll keep an eye on them. We have a very large audience, so I apologize in advance if we don't get to everybody's questions. The first one up is for Dr. Abuza. Sir, From the audience, since COVID, are extremist organizations in Asia making any headway in gaining legitimacy where governments are coming up short in supporting their populations?
So, of all the groups in Indonesia, Jemaah Islamiyah is the one best poised to do this, simply because of their track record on providing social services and humanitarian aid in the past and their structure. Jemaah Ansarut Daulah, the JAD, or the Islamic State umbrella group in Indonesia, has less track record in doing this. Most of the support they give is to people within their organization, especially the families of incarcerated members. And the Mujahideen Indonesia Timur, the MIT, which is based in Central Sulawesi, has a limited experience in providing some social services and addressing, public anger at security forces, yet they're a very small group. In the Philippines, we really haven't seen any group being able to capitalize on this. I will say the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, which now leads the autonomous government in Mindanao, has done a very good job in responding to COVID-19. And that's something for us to watch and support.
Okay, thank you, sir. Lots of questions coming in now. Thank you very much to the audience for your participation. For Commander Bine, what is the likelihood that VEOs or violent extremist organizations will try to weaponize?
Well, that's been a good question for several months. We've been on the lookout for any signs that VEOs are weaponizing or attempting to weaponize COVID. We have seen nothing in traffic. It seems that that the VEOs are still scared of the virus and are not trying to weaponize it at this point.
Okay, great. Next up, for Colonel Maxwell, do our national leaders understand, do you think they understand the role that SOF can play in the era of strategic competition? Do they understand, or are they interested in any of the concepts that you've mentioned so far, sir?
Oh, that's a great question. And of course, I can't speak for the administration, although
Sure.
I think, there's a traditional lack of understanding of special operations and its capabilities. Special operations has often been very insular and, shrouded in myth and mystery sometimes. But I think there is a growing need for it. And we have seen in Congress, especially in the last couple NDAAs, are demands for irregular warfare capabilities, countering unconventional warfare capabilities, influence operations. These are spelled out in Congress. So I think there is an understanding that we do need these capabilities. I think, frankly speaking, in 2016, the National Defense Authorization Act called for the Department of Defense to develop a counter unconventional warfare strategy to counter these, what are now called rogue and revisionist powers. That's been a long time coming, and they didn't make the suspense of 180 days after the signing of the NDA. But I think there's growing understanding, but again, I think that often SOF is viewed as an afterthought, and in particular, I think one of the problems, and the point I really want to emphasize, there's a feeling that SOF does violent extremist organizations and conventional forces do great power competition. And I really want to emphasize that, yes, our conventional military force, our great conventional military force, has to be as strong as possible to deter conflict and fight and win our nation's battles. But great power competition is going to take place more in the gray zone, in that space between peace and war. And those are areas where SOF, in particular, its comparative advantages of governance, influence, and support to indigenous forces and populations can play a big supporting role, supporting our country teams in their mission strategic plans, and supporting, of course, the theater strategies around the world. So that's what I really want to emphasize, that we can't marginalize SOF in great power competition. It has to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time and work across the spectrum of conflict, and I believe it can.
Okay, thank you, sir. Just to clarify, earlier in the poll, when I was initially reading the results, I read them incorrectly to you. Great power competition, as Colonel Maxwell pointed out before he started his plenary brief, came in first place in 33%, which probably is not surprising to most of you in the audience. All right, and the next question up is for Dr. Abuza. Is there any concern for the resurgence of JI in Asia?
Last year, Indonesian security forces arrested the head of JI, Parawijayanto, and they were aghast at the scope of the organization, and especially its financial resources, the number of corporations it owned, plantations, publishing houses, their ability to pay members, pay families who have been of incarcerated members. But JI right now is lying low, but that is a tactical choice. They have never renounced violence. They simply think that it's a bad time to engage in violence. And I think they're waiting for the JAD to be taken apart by Indonesian security forces. And when they see the opportunity, they will resume militant operations. But right now, in the immediate term, I am not concerned about this. But boy, they are working assiduously to continue to grow their network, to recruit, to indoctrinate, run their network of madrasas, and now provide social services and humanitarian assistance in the age of COVID.
Okay, thank you, sir. Next up, Commander Bine. Will it be safe to say that the activities of VEOs will also follow a lockdown and then emerge again after COVID-19 as they were prior to the virus?
I would expect it with the next wave of coronavirus, and the ensuing lockdown, the VEOs will be less cautious. They will not be as constrained by the lockdown. They'll have the experience of working in the lockdown and operating in the lockdown before, and having the confidence to do that and protect themselves to a degree. So I believe that next go around, the VEOs are going to be on their game better, and security forces have to too.
All right, thanks. Okay, we've got a question here from one of our friends at the State Department, but in accordance with our non-attribution policy, we will keep all names out of this one, but I suspect Colonel Maxwell or Dr. Abuza will be able to address this one, maybe both of you. Can you discuss how the tenuous extension of the VFA in the Philippines affects the U.S. DoD presence there? Now, I know we're getting a little bit off subject, but this addresses, this affects both counterterrorism and special operations. So I throw that one open to either one of you if you want to go for it.
Well, I'll start first, and maybe Zach can correct me if I'm wrong. I understand, though, that they walked back the VFA, that they did not, that President Duterte decided not to withdraw from the VFA, and I think that the Visiting Forces Agreement, and I think that's very important. But I think that the political relationship, with President Duterte, has caused some friction in the alliance. Remember, the Philippines and the United States are the longest. It's the longest standing treaty alliance that the U.S. has. And, we have a long history of being allies. So, but the Visiting Forces Agreement, I think, will have impact. But even if it's not withdrawn or abrogated, the fact that we're having these political problems surely impacts on our relationships. Although I remember reading President Duterte saying that regardless of what he felt about the United States, he knows the armed forces of the Philippines and the U.S. military have a great relationship. and he can't do anything about that. So that's a positive sign. But it is problematic. I'm glad that they have not abrogated the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, but it causes friction in the alliance.
Dr. Abuza, anything to add, sir?
I agree with that assessment. I think even without the VFA, we would be able to provide some assistance and training, but it would be a lot harder. And the reality right now is that the Philippines does not have the resources to conduct their myriad of counterterrorism and counterinsurgency operations themselves. They have insufficient ISR capabilities, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance capabilities. Too much of their military budget is simply eaten up by personnel costs, and they just do not have the capabilities to deal with the NPA, Abu Sayyaf, a resurgent Maute group, etc. And so it's really shooting themselves in the foot.
Okay, thank you. Great answers from both of you. All right, next back to Commander Bine. In order to adapt to the new normality, how should SOF train today?
Well, I think the way they're trained currently is provides a great foundation for what's going on. They're trained to be adaptive and to think on their feet and to make decisions on the run, because a lot of these decisions can't be made in a fast enough time period, 3 levels above their head. So I think more of that, more training the forces to be agile and think on their feet is the way that they need to continue to be trained, and at all times be conscious of the virus and protect themselves. Over.
Okay, all right. To Colonel Maxwell, dovetailing off of that question, where do you see SOF in the next 5 years in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, the one-word answer is hopefully everywhere. I think we have a lot of friends, partners, and allies throughout the region, and I think that we want to engage with them, and we want to help our friends, partners, and allies achieve our mutual objectives. Again, the values I think that I laid out, I think those are our common values to like-minded countries. So I think that SOF will be part of all domains, air, land, and sea. Maybe less so cyber and space. I don't think SOF has any spacemen yet, but we are playing a role in cyber as well in conjunction with Cyber Command. But certainly air, land, and sea. We have forces that can operate in all 3 domains, and I think the countries that we have been engaging with, more, some less. I hope that we can increase our engagement because really we've got to be able to counter the influence of China throughout the region, and I think that that's a common objective to everybody without causing conflict and without causing China to take negative action towards countries because they engage with us. It's a delicate diplomatic balance, and SOF has to operate in support of diplomatic efforts and first do no harm. But I think that we have a role to play throughout the region, and we should be ready to be engaged on a long-term effort. And that's one of the things that I would really hope that we can get to a point where we can have long-term presence in critical areas rather than just discrete events once in a while. We need to have a sustained long-term presence. And why is that? Because we have to have situational understanding of ground truth, and we have to develop and sustain those relationships. And that really can only be done with presence. And so that's where I think we need to focus on.
Okay, thank you, sir. All right, and we have time for one more question, so I will turn it back over to Dr. Abuza. Why don't we see, or why haven't we seen greater terrorist organization activities in some of the other countries in Southeast Asia, like Malaysia, Myanmar, Thailand, etc.?
during the JI era, Malaysia was simply too important to the organization in terms of moving money and fundraising. That has changed with the rise of the Islamic State. It did actively target Malaysia. There were at least 13 fairly sophisticated attacks that were thwarted in that time. So it's on the radar screen of the organization. On a per capita basis, Malaysia, there are far more Malaysians within the Islamic State than there are Indonesians. So this is a concern. We are looking very closely at the potential for radicalization amongst the Rohingyas. The Burmese military, the Tatmadaw, continues to link the Arakan Rohingya Salvation Army as a terrorist group. There's no evidence that they are anything more than a bunch of half-assed militants that have inflicted terrible tragedy on their people. I am always concerned about the radicalization of Rohingya diaspora. So we've seen some Rohingya radicals in Malaysia and elsewhere get arrested for engaging in terrorist activities. In the past, JI tried to use the Rohingya cause to bomb an attempt to bomb the Myanmar embassy in Jakarta that was thwarted. In southern Thailand, what you see is a very deep-rooted insurgency. It is not a Salafist insurgency. These are not Wahhabis. They're Shafis. They are committed to the creation of a Patani Malay state. And don't think there's not political violence there. There is plenty of it. Almost 8,000 people have been killed since 2004. For a period of time, in 2007 era to 2010, over 50 IEDs a month. That's dropped precipitously now. And interestingly enough, the main rebel group at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic declared a unilateral ceasefire. And that actually made the Thai military quite angry because the BRN militants really seem to be angling to gain much greater legitimacy and popular support because the Muslim Deep South provinces were disproportionately hit by the COVID-19 pandemic. And so they really looked better by holding to the ceasefire that is starting to fray right now.
Okay, great. Well, ladies and gentlemen, our time is coming to an end. It's gone too quick, and the time that our panelists had to speak with us is definitely not enough. I'm sure all three of them could speak to you for days on these subjects, but unfortunately our time is coming to a close. Before I wrap up though, I will give our panelists one last chance to provide us with some closing thoughts. We'll go in reverse order from the way we presented our presentations today. So first up will be Colonel Dave Maxwell. Sir, it's been great having you, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Lumpy, and thank you to everyone. I'd just like to say that, special operations employment in Asia is very important, and it's a lot different than in Iraq and Afghanistan. It takes a much subtler form of employment, but it's really relationship built. And so many of you in the audience, from many of our partner allied countries, it is the relationships that our special operations forces build with your countries that really contribute to the United States and your country to be able to solve complex political military problems that are of mutual interest because we share values, and hopefully as long as we have a common understanding of the operational environment, we'll share strategy as well. Thank you.
Okay. Alex, over to you.
Okay, as COVID is in mid-progress, we're seeing the economic slowdown already start, lack of opportunity, loss of jobs, humanitarian crisis. This is an opportunity for us to band together as a global community and to rely and learn to rely on one another. This is imperative if we're going to be able to combat these international VEOs and together in great power competition to maintain the order that we have that has made us successful over the past 70 years. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commander Bine. And finally, Dr. Abuza, sir.
Back in 2002, I was interviewing the spiritual head of Jemaah Islamiyah, Abu Bakr Bashir, and I asked him whether he would achieve his goal of an Islamic state across the Nusantara in his lifetime, and he started to chuckle and said, of course not. Indonesians are bad Muslims. The point that I took away from this is that these guys play a very long game. They do not expect to achieve their goals anytime soon. Their responsibility before God, though, is to move the ball down the field. COVID-19, the pandemic, haphazard government responses, often the over-militarization of government responses, the economic catastrophe that is going to hit, whether recession, unemployment. These all give these organizations great opportunities to delegitimize the government and build up their own base of support.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you to all three gentlemen. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here tonight. We've all benefited from your expertise. I'd like to also give a special thanks to our visual information department professionals. Those are the guys and girls behind the scenes who help things run smoothly so we can present these things to you. They're the ones who know how the technology works. I'd like to also give a special thanks to my co-moderator, Lieutenant Colonel Jason Clark, who, by the way, next week will be pinning on full colonel. So thanks to everybody, and thanks for your participation, and to our alumni as well. Before I depart, I'd just like to share with you that this year marks the center's 25th anniversary, and we're grateful to have all of you commemorating this milestone with us through this engagement here tonight. Our anniversary theme, as you can see here, speaks to the valued hindsight of our 25-year history, our appreciation of the insight you have all brought us here today, and the foresight we strive for in the future as APCSS continues to educate, connect, and empower in these challenging times. We are signing off for now. Thank you all, everyone, for a great event, and aloha.